Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Today, it's my absolute honor to have Ethan Kent from Project for Public Spaces with us. How are you doing today, Ethan?
Great, Brad. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. It's Ethan was with us at our most recent expo, and it was great to have him down here in Roanoke. And I think you enjoyed your time down here as well, didn't you?
I did, and it was CityWorks was a conference I'd sort of admired from afar, and really known it was great and heard from many people. But of course, it exceeded my expectations, and loved connecting with the tight-knit community in Roanoke and the community you've drawn and built and brought together through the conference as well.
Well, thank you. And I know that you've actually, you guys had done some work down here in Roanoke in terms of helping with our public square downtown, but you've been engaged in kind of the creation of public spaces through your work at Project for Public Spaces for a long time, and these are spaces that work well for the communities they live in. But how do you kind of define the work that you do, and what drew you to this?
So, our work is really just an ongoing question of how, when you focus on public spaces and making them places, how do we best work together to make that happen? And how do we overcome the various, limiting factors and obstacles to better public spaces and places? So I'm lucky that I was sort of, born into this challenge and have gotten to learn about it from many different angles and many contexts around the world. My father founded the organization in 1975, and so I sort of grew up, traveling around the world with him, looking at public spaces, working with communities in this lens. And but every it's a constant challenge. It's a constant learning curve for us. And of course, we learn the most from people in communities that are actually dealing with these challenges. But it's a time when we're thinking bigger and bigger about this. We're realizing that when you focus on place and you focus on public spaces, it really turns upside down the whole shaping of cities, the way we finance them, govern them, the processes through which they're shaped. So we're looking at a lot of those issues as sort of the limiting factors, and and a way to really galvanize the capacity of communities to shape themselves. So I think the CityWorks Expo has been dealing with many of these issues, and the scale at which you're working embodies, we think, sort of the scale of success for cities and towns of all scales. We sort of see CityWorks as sort of the soul of representing sort of the soul of the placemaking movement. That's not dissimilar from, but can help inspire similar efforts all around the world.
Well, again, you're going to have to stop complimenting us here. But I'm intrigued that you mentioned kind of like turning a space into a place, and this idea of placemaking is obviously a big part of what you guys do, and it's kind of entered the colloquial speech nowadays. And I wonder, when you hear the word placemaking, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's sort of it's a definition in a word that we think it's good that people are sort of continuing to define it, and sort of its definition keeps evolving, and that's good. We don't want it to be sort of defined by any one sector or discipline alone, or around any one solution set. But just generally, I see it as sort of the collective effort to shape shared value in the public realm, to maximize the benefit, the public benefit to all of our urbanization.
It's shared value is such an interesting perspective. It's seems so difficult to create that in this segmented world that we live in. And I think you guys, it's a really interesting perspective to focus on space and place as a way of creating shared value. I have great admiration for y'all, and really look forward to how not just you all, but all of us together combine to work to create those things together.
Yeah. No, it's these networks. We see it's networks of people coming at this from very different angles that are going to lead to change. And I think just as our built environment has been segmented, so have the people shaping it. And so it's at every scale. It's creating networks around an intersection, a block, citywide and nationally and internationally, that we think we're going to create this sort of step change in It's going back to a common sense. It's not that complicated, but we've gotten away from it, and it's the siloization, is sort of isolation of people and communities that's the problem, but that's created this sort of downward spiral. I see it as, in a way, everyone's competing to take value from shared value. Yet it's the places that we love the most, the places that we succeed the most, where people sort of naturally actually compete to contribute to shared value. The businesses, the citizens, the buildings that contribute the most to a good place, actually the ones that succeed the most. But it's been no one's job to facilitate that, to make that happen. And the skills that are needed for that have been sort of isolated into different disciplines. They're all competing to control the shaping of cities, but in the process perpetuating that isolation and segmentation of disciplines.
Do you think that in some ways it's a lack of collective vision, in some ways, that we become too individualized in the way that we look at things?
Yeah, I think we're not asked the right questions. Essentially, we're asked, what kind of road do you want to have, building do you want to have, store. We're not asked what kind of place do we want to have. And people are good at. We think communities actually are good at envisioning these things if they're asked the right questions. And sometimes inspired a little bit. I think looking at images, we all need to be inspired and educated. I need to be, before I start thinking about what the potential of a place is. I need to look at some similar examples from other parts of the world that get my imagination going. But it's we all need to we need the right processes that allow collective inspiration and education, and a sort of freedom to think bigger and but also take a different process of iterative short-term experiments that can get us some momentum towards something bigger as well.
This is one of the questions that I'm in my personal work have dealt with, is how to get people to think differently about things and approach things from different angles. And even I really like your perspective on the short-term kind of limited intervention that can be then much bigger in impact. How have you found success in getting people to think outside of those boxes?
To supporting the sort of, we call it lighter, quicker, cheaper. And in a way, a lot of our work since, we were started in 1975, a lot of our work has been promoting the sort of short-term, low-cost, programmatic activities, the movable seating, there's been sort of almost the formulaic. We've been, we could be accused of being formulaic in sort of what these sort of kit of parts is sometimes. We've always tried to emphasize that it's not the solution. It's actually the governance, that's the community capacity that's built through the process of doing these short-term efforts that allow spaces to keep evolving and be sustained. The sort of iteration, the conversations that happen when people discuss, does this work, does this not work? If it fails, you create this learning effort and sort of reduce people's fear of failure and risk. So it's we think it's sometimes under the phrase the focus on tactical urbanism or short-term efforts and placemaking, even it attracts too much attention on the stuff and not on the civic infrastructure, the community capacity collaboration, the process of shaping these spaces on an ongoing basis that is really the valuable infrastructure that sustains and evolves these places in a unique local way.
Well, that's I think you guys often the part of what you guys do that gets the most outward input is the stuff that you guys build. But as you rightly point out, it's really about the impacts and the impacts on people and the infrastructure that comes from the people that deal with those spaces that you guys are interested in creating, is it not?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the human capital, the social capital that's built through the process. And there was an MIT study recently on placemaking that showed that in the making that the benefits developed. It's not just in the place. So that's and that's a big departure from sort of the more discipline-led approaches. And we think most of the shaping, the sort of most the advanced sort of progressive wing of most disciplines does what we call place-sensitive design. They engage the community, they work in a collaborative way, multidisciplinary, but it's still applying their solution set in a responsive way. It's not really starting with the place as the goal, with the community as the lead, and facilitating, informing, inspiring their capacity, their leadership in shaping their places. So it's disciplines aren't taught to sort of let go of some power, and then we think there'll be more demand, communities will be better clients to draw on the skills and visions of disciplines. But naturally, these professionals are sort of don't want to let go of too much control of the shaping of communities.
Well, in some ways, what you guys are doing is asking people to admit that they or we don't have the answers to the questions that we face. And that I think can be a really difficult conversation to have.
Exactly. Yeah. No. It's I think we all have to see ourselves as sort of facilitators of change, and politicians too. Have to. They're told that they have to have the answers. We're all taught that we're supposed to have the answer and sort of push it and impose it in a sense. When we actually build more political capital, community capacity through more of a process of inquiry, an ongoing conversation. That creates. If there's some conflict, if there's some pushback, if something doesn't work, that creates more interest and more dialogue. And if it's set up right, if the process is set up right.
And so really it's about experimentation. You can learn as much whether you succeed or not, I suppose, in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's this relationship between the focus on place. It's I'm not saying that everything's this just relationships and dialogue and governance. It's the focus on something practical, the short-term actions that really ground the conversation, lead it to action. And ground the relationships and anchor these relationships in a more ongoing way as well. So we see it takes a place to create a community and a community to create a place. It's this sort of reflexive axiom that they keep building each other iteratively.
But I think you guys are kind of right in this place now where we see more and more people recognizing that how we define things has huge impacts on what those things turn out to be, and that you guys are right on the cutting edge of saying that, hey, these places that we live in have huge impacts on who the people that come out of those places are.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. No, we shape our communities thereafter our communities shape us. Winston Churchill said we shape our buildings thereafter our buildings shape us. We have to realize that it's right now the vision of the future is you look up if you Google the future of cities, you get a vision that's not really about people. It's more about icons and buildings. It's not one that's going to be very innovative, inclusive, human, culturally creative. But yet it's the one that's sort of seeping into our consciousness and certainly dominant within the leading design and development schools. And we need to turn that upside down. We think we can create more value, more demand for good architecture development. Creating a city that's more porous, that's more human, that's more diverse and social. But that vision needs to be needs to be communicated, and we need models that show that creates broader private and shared value.
Well, now, what when you're thinking about these places and when you're thinking about a place that works, what are there things that you think are elemental to those places?
There's things that I think people are understanding better and better. Almost too well. Obviously the sort of the human scale environment, the small scale stores and the local businesses and the street design and so forth. But it's again I look more increasingly we look more and more at the what's the governance structure there? What are the mechanisms for financing and preserving, sustaining those structures, as well. So, But we think the way to seed them is, and sort of turn this way down, is lead with the most public spaces, lead with a public destination, and it sort of reorients a lot of focuses. Most development, most sort of urbanization is more led by private development, by the developer. And we see this time and time again when developers lead with making the public realm work, public space work, and often, and I say, the public space can be private space, it can be retail, it can be sometimes, a good bookstore, coffee shop. A third place can be as important or more important than, truly public spaces. But leading with these anchors, making them a destination, is the way to really drive sustained, authentic value for. And it's, of course, communities, most developers aren't set up to do that and to then capture some of the value that's created in that. So we need to support that, those models.
And but I would assume that you're not necessarily opposed to private developers coming in and do this. It's more about the mindset, I suppose, that this is being done with. That I would imagine you would think that even if it's done by a private developer, that those public spaces can drive the values that those private developers put into their actions. Could they not?
Yeah, no question. And we think we sort of actually have the easiest time convincing developers of this, and definitely there's a lot of developers. Not a lot, but there's the ones that the sort of small scale developers we think are sort of really doing this the best. So it's, but no matter what sector is leading, we sort of try to go with that momentum, but also say that to really sustain their success and ensure that they need to move towards a more multi-sector collaboration responsibility for the success of a district. So when we've worked with developers, it's often, helping to eventually set up sort of a not-for-profit that has a broader sense of ownership responsibility for the public realm, and can bring in government, different other volunteerism, raise money from more diversified sources, volunteerism, philanthropy, and so forth as well. So that it's no matter what sector leads, it's public sector, private sector, sometimes foundations, sometimes businesses, sometimes just communities. It's always how do we get the other sectors to be part of a more sustained governance structure.
Well, now you've done this all over the planet, right? So how has it been different for you when you're working with these groups in South America and Europe as opposed to it is in the United States or beyond?
Yeah, no, so it's been really fun, and like about half of our work is international, and every part of the world I say is sort of leading in some way and sort of holding back in another, and so we find it really important to sort of globally network this conversation, so different regions can see how they are leading and doing something really well, but also be inspired by other areas. So like in Australia, the government's leading it. They're doing a good job. They're very progressive, but doesn't have the same volunteerism of the businesses, of philanthropy, of communities. So they're looking to sort of devolve government to communities and developing good models that I think actually are going to be really useful for the U.S. to learn from, because we haven't had the same pressure. Where we actually have done a lot more than them in that sense. We've organizing a conference in a month or so in the beginning of May in Nairobi. It will be a global conference with UN Habitat on public spaces, but looking at Africa and learning from, supporting what's working about public spaces in informal communities and informal vending, and making sure they don't copy what's and what's not working, what we're doing in the U.S. in many areas. We're organizing a big conference, our big placemaking week event this year is going to be in Amsterdam, and connecting a lot of the European placemaking movement that is more disconnected, because in a way urbanism there is pretty successful, but as it's more static, there's not as much. They really want to look at management and programming and of space as well. They said design is so good there that they almost let it lead too much, and have forgotten how to engage communities in the design process and the management and ongoing programming of public space. So we, in Latin America, we have a big conference in Valparaiso in November for the placemaking movement for Latin America, and there's a great sort of grassroots activist spirit that's really driving the movement. A lot of short-term activities, but looking at the favelas and the slums and the creativity that's emerging there. But also the great innovation from government and from looking at streets, and the sort of pedestrian bicycle movements there are really strong. So we want to sort of go with, celebrate all the energy around participating and shaping our cities that we're seeing, and connect it into a global movement. And likewise we see in the U.S. and in rural and mid-sized cities, and this is where a lot of the energy is in the U.S. and we need to coalesce it and communicate it and connect it globally.
And I think you guys do such a good job of contextualizing your work everywhere, but it's absolutely crucial to what you're doing. I mean, there's these public squares that exist in Nairobi. I imagine those spaces are not something that we could even fathom here in much of the U.S., and so that work has to be very different here.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, we do. Yeah, the process is. Certainly the solutions are different, and the aesthetics is going to look very different. But the process and the governance is actually remarkably similar. So we lead people through similar engagement exercises and evaluation tools of public spaces, and then we of course learn a lot from each of these places. But humans are similar everywhere, and we all are craving to sort of take ownership over our public realms and see ourselves reflected in our public spaces as well, and what makes them work, and the process of shaping them is actually quite similar everywhere.
Well, now you've obviously been putting that process into place all over the world over the years, and I'm sure you've learned a ton through that time. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned from being engaged in this kind of community work?
Let's see. I guess some of my work in Australia, as I was saying, has been really inspiring. Learning that we can actually scale up a lot of this thinking to really restructure city governments and on many different scales, and how every department's job can be to create place or place capital, and how that changes the relationships between different city agencies, different disciplines, and of course the relationship of the city to communities. So how and the culture shift that has to occur there, the relationships, the trust building, the sort of the openness that occurs because of this focus on place within government is really exciting. It actually helps achieve many outcomes more efficiently, from transparency in government to health, environmental outcomes. All the goals of strategic planning that cities have, we find start to fall into place and be accelerated with a focus on place. So something we're just learning about a lot. One way we're starting to learn a lot more is through this joint center with Brookings that we were just launching on innovation, placemaking, and inclusion. And so it's a center to sort of understand and develop the models to accelerate innovation and its benefits to place and its benefits to inclusion in cities around the world. And we're first looking at some of these innovation districts and trying to understand how innovative they actually are, and if they're creating good places, and how the places are supporting innovation, and then of course how how inclusive are the benefits really shared with these places and people of lesser means in some of these places. So I know that some of your work in Roanoke is centered on some ideas around this innovation and the co-working and so forth. And so we see, we want this to these models to be able to apply to the sort of district scale, and how all kinds of downtowns and small and even main streets can support innovation, can support place attachment, entrepreneurship through social density, through the mixing of people in place, and through some of the economic tools and focus that Brooks is looking at as well. So we've realized the sort of economy shaping and place shaping have been disconnected and almost competing in a sense, or taking value from each other. We want to connect these mechanisms through this collaboration with Brookings.
That's a really interesting perspective in terms of all of this really being part of the same toolbox, so to speak, and that really they're all different paths to get to the same goal, but what we're realizing is that they're more and more interconnected than ever. I think that this is, if I will toot CityWorks' horn, this is what we really try and focus on, is that there's no one magic bullet to making great places. It comes down to a myriad of different tools and tactics and perspectives to make that happen.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, no, and you guys are embodying this in the way you're hosting these conversations and bringing in many different perspectives and experiences and applying them in Roanoke as well.
It is interesting to me that I think you mentioned, leading some of these conversations about inclusivity and things like that, and it's interesting, particularly for me, given the fact that a lot of times in the past they've had these public engagement campaigns that haven't necessarily done a great job of giving voice and being inclusive of everyone. I'm intrigued to know how you guys, other than through skilled facilitation, kind of make sure that you're getting everyone that needs to be at the table there.
Mm-hmm. It's something we keep trying to do better and iterating on. A lot of our early work was doing a lot of user analysis and intercept surveys. Trying to, actually what people do in public space is often more revealing even than what people say they do. Or, there's a whole, there's lots that you can and should do to engage and understand behavior in space. So we still do digital engagement and on-site workshops and intercept surveys. One method that we've been using a lot more and more is actually going out and doing some temporary improvements to the space with where there's some momentum with some people that are really passionate about the place, but then engaging people in that space that come to the space and saying, well, what's working about this, what's not, how would you like to improve it? So it sort of creates this idea of let's get something to happen and debate it, and let's not just wait around. So it's it's not leading with public input. It's not that's to us that's a sort of an exhausting process sometimes, and that only really attracts the people that either say no or the people that are most that are dominating the process already. So we need to sort of disrupt that a little bit and create a culture where where everyone discusses these things and thinks and listens to each other and doesn't just and it sees themselves as a co-problem solver for their community, not just as pushing their solution or challenging pushing their problem, which is really the only way they've been allowed to participate in their communities in the past.
Well, that's sometimes I think that can be the hardest part, can it, to get to a place not necessarily of shared values that in the long run you want to get there, but creating a place where you have or everyone is seeing the same problem can be just as equally difficult, can it not?
Yeah, and that's why when we do these workshops, we have something called the place game. They get people to sort of take a step back away from their one. Usually, people come to a workshop with, this is the big problem. This is my one issue. It's safety. It's health. It's children or something like that. And we think the focus on place and these questions that we've developed allow people to look at it more holistically, but also really listen to each other in a sort of an appreciative, respectful way. And in the process, realize that they actually, their issues overlap, and the solutions start to overlap as well. So defining the problem is important. Defining it more broadly is important, and then defining it appreciatively. How do we create, not just deal with it, take a problem-focused approach of just addressing different problems, but actually create a community that thrives and can in the process address these problems. Is the way to reorient the conversation. We say the best way to prevent your community from changing for the worse is to have a vision for what you want it to be. And so that's really what placemaking is about, and bringing us from the sort of just the sort of negative dynamic to actually people that are negative to. So what would make this community work, and how do we make sure to have a vision and start to articulate that vision in the public realm that attracts investment, attracts people on the terms of the local communities. Negative effects of gentrification and change in those communities. and continue to create the place attachment and ownership of the community that makes it more resilient in the face of different outside pressures.
Do you find that there are certain communities that are more willing to engage in this process, and kind of what do you think makes a community ready to enter in a change-making process like this?
There's a lot of, we used to be brought into projects after they failed. We were brought in to fix a lot of failed public spaces, and increasingly over 40 years now, we get brought in earlier and earlier. But a lot of times it's because of a problem. A good crisis, can be the catalyst for creating a great place. So a proposed development, when the community is being negative, and there's something they don't like. The opportunity to we say the best way to fight at something negative is actually, again, be positive. So it's moving that, it's taking that energy of something, that we have a problem, we have inequality, or we have a, we don't like this new development that's proposed, we have major traffic violence, or whatever it is, using that problem to move towards not just addressing that problem, but being able to more fundamentally address that problem with a broader focus on place is a real opportunity. So that's those are the areas we get involved with a lot. And of course it's a confluence of problems that we all need to address now, and we see place as a way to pull together people from disparate issues and causes to more fundamentally address all their disparate issues and causes in a more fun and efficient and inspired way.
Very, very interesting. Well, I just love how you guys reflect the interdisciplinarity of everything and see the comprehensive picture, which I think so few of us see on a day-to-day basis. I love how that all works, and I wonder if we could perhaps wrap up on one of the success stories that you like to think back on the most.
Sure. Yeah. I think a story we talk about a lot is and I know you guys have featured it in your conferences, is Detroit. And we've actually worked. Detroit and the state of Michigan is the state and the city we've worked the most in, and at many different stages, and with many different sectors, and in context throughout the state, rural, urban, and in the state of Detroit we've worked in the city of Detroit we've worked a lot in campus marches, and sort of helped get this public space to happen that then eventually attracted Dan Gilbert and a lot of development in the downtown. We also worked in some of the neighborhoods with Kresge Foundation and Kellogg Foundation and so forth. We feel like there's sort of an overall narrative of Detroit that can offer a lot of lessons to cities around the world where, and there's certainly lots of tensions and problems, and those I think, also yield, further, innovation and certainly issues that need to continue to be addressed if any one sector or population is dominating the downtown and so forth. But we're seeing this overall narrative of Detroit is this model where everyone's coming, whether they've lived there forever, they're coming there, they're competing to contribute to the story of Detroit, to the shared places. Not just a city you consume. And so I think we've gone through this era of sort of the livable city, which we need a lot more of, and we're not creating enough of. There's a real demand for walkable urbanism, but the way to actually create it more and to create it in a more accessible, affordable way is in a sense actually through a more lovable city, and a city that everyone can help co-create. And I think Detroit is embodying that in the sort of the lighter, quicker, cheaper approaches to public spaces and to the governance and participation in the city, and to the larger story it's telling to the world. Come here and help shape it. And so to me, that's for smaller cities that are a little more affordable. Smaller towns, what you're selling isn't just the livability. It's and you won't win on that. You won't compete, and you shouldn't win on that. It's the ability to help participate in further shaping the identity, the shared experience, the social connections and relationships in a community. So to make the future of our town, cities, world more livable, we need to make it more lovable, and we can do that through empowering and challenging us all to help shape our environments.
It's a great message there. I mean, the place attachment is something that we've obviously seen has huge repercussions for everyone, and that just the idea of how we can interact with one another, but also that once you engage in a place, you're drawn to that place much more than you were beforehand, that you feel invested in a way that you didn't before, and it's just a powerful message that I think every community can learn from.
Yeah, no question. I think we're just learning about the importance of that, and how that really changes the goals of cities, and how it can start to support especially the more vulnerable communities and more more challenged communities around the world. How the focus on place attachment can drive success on many levels. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on and taking the time today, Ethan. If any of y'all listening want to hear Ethan's talk from last year's CityWorks Expo, you can check out our website, cityworksexpo.com. But thank you again, Ethan, for being on here.
My pleasure, Brad. I look forward to continuing to keep in touch with you and the broader CityWorks community. And please keep us engaged, and feel free to reach out anytime.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.